I'm Fatima AlSebaie, an analyst in the research department of Derasat. My research interests in the area of digital technologies such as the blockchain and artificial intelligence and their adoption in the GCC region, and also in women's representation in the IT field. Today, we will talk about COVID-19 impact on cybersecurity and public health. The COVID-19 outbreak has introduced almost overnight changes to various landscapes across the globe. With increasing global concern around the spread of coronavirus, digital technologies like artificial intelligence, drones, robots, thermal cameras, tracing apps, and data analysis were utilized in responding to the pandemic and protecting the public health. Also, during the pandemic, government and businesses offices globally issued mandates for employees to work from home. So a new kind of challenges are being faced in the cybersecurity landscape. And in the Kingdom of Bahrain, ever since the outbreak of COVID-19, the government, following the World Health Organization guidelines, has been implementing a critical response plan that includes contact tracing, social distancing measurements, healthcare facility utilization. The government is leveraging various digital technologies to government's response plan, particularly in contact tracing and providing government services online and in the commerce and education as well. Thus, it is clear to everyone how much the use of digital technologies has increased during the pandemic time. However, this must be structurally supported by a robust digital infrastructure and cybersecurity measurements. In this webinar, we have invited Dr. Michel to talk about this issue and discuss the importance of redefining the future of cybersecurity in the light of impact of COVID-19. Dr. Michel Belfer is currently president of Euro-Gulf Information Center, Italy, senior lecturer in international relations, terrorism and security at the Metropolitan University Prague, and editor and chief of Central European Journal of International and Security Studies. He also sits on the steering committee of the Global Institute of Cybersecurity Technologies and the editorial boards of New Perspectives and the International Journal of Humanitarian Studies, among other editorial, research, and scientific boards. In addition to numerous works of scholarships and presentation in academic and political forums, Dr. Michel is also a frequent international media contributor and has appeared on the BBC and CNN, often speaks on Radio France International, and has written of the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and an assortment of others. Michel's focus is security in the Arab Gulf and wider Middle East region, with an emphasis on terrorism, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, radical ideologies, small state foreign policies, and geopolitics. Welcome, Dr. Michel, and thanks for accepting the invitation. So let's start now, and there will be 15 to 20 minutes for question at the end. So if anyone has any question, please feel free to submit it in the tab of the Q&A. Dr. Michel, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Doctor. First, I want to say the one thing that's missing from that over large biography, I have to reduce it, but the one thing that's missing is COVID specialist. I do everything humanly possible these days not to talk about COVID because it's come to dominate most of our thinking about everything. But I've since acknowledged that, and I think that all of us are now trying to adjust ourselves to the new world in which COVID is so central. Not just COVID as the virus, but COVID as an expose of both our strengths and our weaknesses. And so I'm very grateful today to be speaking to you, live from Rome. Italy was, of course, one of the epicenters of the virus. We've since passed that torch on, sadly, to others. So it's really a great honor for me to be here today with you, speaking to you in Rome, looking at our experiences here in Europe, the experiences in Bahrain and the wider Gulf in dealing with COVID-19. I'd like, before I start anything, to thank you for being moderator today. And I'd like, of course, to thank the Derasat team. It's always a pleasure to speak at Derasat and with Derasat. I'd like to thank Sheikh Abdallah bin Ahmed Al Khalifa, the chairman of Derasat as well, for providing us this opportunity. Sheikh Naila, Dr. Qatada, Dr. Omar, Carrie for putting all the pieces together. So before I even begin, I'd like to really thank the Derasat team. These are very trying times, and it's important that, and I think this is something we'll come back to in a little bit, but it's important that we don't just freeze ourselves out of our community living just because of the virus and any other kind of global challenge. We have tools at our disposal to make sure that our communities remain strong, remain active, and continue to communicate no matter what is thrown in front of us. So perhaps the first lesson to jot down is that when everything seems hopeless, it's not necessarily hopeless. We have tools at our disposal. It's just how we learn to use those tools that matters, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. It's about understanding how that wheel can be utilized. I also want to stress first and foremost at the beginning in my brief talk, because I know we could spend an entire semester discussing this issue. We could talk about it for 13 nonstop weeks, 2.5 hours every day. But I mean, we don't have that kind of luxury of time. So I'm going to try to condense it into a 20-25 minute talk, hopefully leaving enough fertile grounds so that we can have a good discussion afterwards, because I think there's going to be many more questions that I will raise in this discussion than there's possibly scope for answering them. But I'm not excusing myself from answering them. I'm going to try to answer them also. So first and foremost, I also want to stress that I am not a specialist in cybersecurity per se. I rather specialize in security issues, from geography and geopolitics straight through to terrorism and asymmetric warfare. That's my area of specialization. But cyber is a place where geopolitics is now playing itself out and terrorism is playing itself out. So instead of looking at it as two different quadrants, we have to look at it as part of one whole. And from my perspective, cyber has just become another theater where people in states are being challenged by other people in other states, where ideas are being generated, where they're being germinated, where they're being shared, and where people form communities. Sometimes they don't need to be in a physical proximity anymore. You can form a community, you can talk. Sometimes this is for the betterment of civilization. Sometimes it's for the detriment of civilization. But we have to acknowledge that cyber has simply become a place, another domain where people are able to meet each other, be it in a strategic and security perspective, or be it also for social and for information, as we're doing today. The emphasis here, however, I should stress, is on people and states, because much of what we're going to find when we peer into this proverbial looking glass is that at the end of the day, there are hands typing away at keyboards. And although we call the set of activities cybersecurity or challenges to cybersecurity, and we do sometimes get this impression that they're taking place in this anonymous space, but they do have a real impact on real people's lives. They do impact people's sense of security, their well-being and their safety. So there is a bridge that needs to be built at the very beginning between the kinetic world, that is the world of the material. I don't know why I pinched myself, to remind us that we are all real, and the world of cyber, in which you can disappear, you can become anonymous, and we have to make sure to remember that at the end of the day there is a person typically behind those keyboards. Artificial intelligence and machine learning is changing that. We're not quite there yet, but even there, you're going to find the hand of a person behind those machineries. So it is important to keep in mind that you cannot necessarily separate those two realms. Now, before moving on with today's talk, I also would like maybe to remind us a little bit that we should use our experience today. This is, I think, quite interesting experience that we'll have. in coping with coronavirus, coping with COVID-19, to learn about how ICT, that is information communications technology, we don't really call it that anymore, it's simply called computing, but how that world and the kinetic world interact. Here I am, I'm in Rome, thousands of kilometers away from our friends and colleagues in Derasat, in Bahrain, in the middle of Al-Khalij, in the middle of the Gulf. I know that there are people who are joining us from around the world, essentially, and this is amazing. But it's our conversation in this regard is just as real as if we were in the same room from one another, because the speech act, the ability that somebody has, in this case, myself and our moderator, we have the ability of having a conversation, and you guys can chime in during the question and answer. And it doesn't affect neither the ability of broadcasting the message or receiving the message. You could be in the same room, or we could be on the same computer screen. The effect is more or less the same. We don't necessarily require physicality, but there are aspects that do require more physicality. I'll try to show today how cybersecurity can be redefined slightly to include more of the impact of on the end user, which is people. COVID-19, for all the disaster and the destruction that it's brought into individual people's lives, is definitely reformulating the manner in which we see, how we use, how we deploy the tools that we have at our disposal. Not everything, and this is something I really want to emphasize, because it's always so easy for us to get stuck in a debate about cybersecurity, that it focuses on the doom and gloom of these technologies, that they're dehumanizing an experience, or that they're being, manipulating tools to undermine security and they undermine public trust. Cyber issues, this is definitely part of it. Cybersecurity is about stopping those kind of threats and challenges, and the media does emphasize and focus more on the negative side of cyber issues, whether it's election manipulation or it's the cyber attacks or disinformation campaigns. I mean, in Bahrain, you guys know this firsthand. In the last elections, there was all kinds of attempts to try to manipulate the elections and to disrupt the elections. But I also have to say there are many positive things that come out of cybersecurity and the realm of the digital landscape. And so in terms of our understanding of these tools, I think we really have to weigh the two sides, both the negative and how those tools can be manipulated, but also how they can reinforce our social engagements, our sciences, the way that we communicate to each other in a way that was never appreciated, before. For today's talk, I'll be very clear, because I know that not everybody is a specialist in cyber, so I'll start at the very, very basic. I want to provide a little bit about what cybersecurity is, what it means, because a lot of people pass the terminology around without really gauging what the actual implications are. In that first section of determining what cybersecurity means, the basics of what it means, I will also talk about the twin peaks of cybersecurity challenges and what kind of effect they can have within a society. The second thing I would like to do is talk a little bit about what additions we could add to our understanding of cybersecurity. It's not to say that these additions that I'll present have not been thought of before. It's just about how we can include them in a general understanding of cybersecurity. And this also would deal a little bit with healthcare as a sector that requires the tools of cyber in order to be more effective. And then finally, before we get to the question and answer, I want to talk a little bit about the unique case of Bahrain. I know that Bahrain has experienced now in the last few days a sharp increase in the number of cases. But if you look at it as a whole, from the beginning of the crisis until now, Bahrain has fared very, very well in maintaining low numbers, both of casualties from the virus, but also in restricting the flow of the virus. After all, we're talking about a relatively small state, and it's an island state, which means that, of course, you can contain it from the outside, but once it's entered, the idea would be that the contagion would be very, very quickly, but that hasn't happened. For the most part, it's because the government policies snapped into action very, very quickly. And because they snapped into action pretty quickly, we can see that there are very important lessons that can be learned from Bahrain's experience in combating COVID-19. Those experiences may not fit, they're not a blueprint necessarily for every case, but if you see the broader pictures and how the kinetic mixed with the cyber to create a solid platform for trying to slow down, if not stop altogether, the virus, there are some very important lessons that can be learned. Now, for today's talk, I should also point out there's going to be a lot of, first, second, thirds, 1, 2, 3s. Please bear with me. I know if you're jotting things down, you're going to have point 1, point 1, point 1. It's going to be a little confusing. But of course, like always, I'm very happy to provide you my notes. My notes are also very convoluted, but if anybody's interested in just going over some of the thoughts that I've had in the lead up to today's session, I'm more than happy to send them out to you. Okay, so let's go to the basics. What is cybersecurity? Typically, there are 3 core aspects of cybersecurity. The first is network security. This is your hardware security. So this is securing your computers, securing the network. Every time you plug in, if you have an Apple, even a personal network, and you're trying to sync between your iPad and your iPhone and your MacBook, you have 3, that's 3 parts of your network. You want to secure that network. You don't want an interruption into that network. You want the hardware of your network to be secured. You want to stop attack. You want to prevent attacks on your network. You want to attack. You don't want to attack. You want to stop opportunistic attacks as well. Very often, if you have installed any kind of defensive software onto your devices, you will also see how often somebody is trying to add malware to your system and therefore to disrupt your network. This is only your personal. Imagine in government or imagine in large corporations, you have huge networks and those networks need to be protected. The second aspect of cybersecurity is, and this one I always feel is the more difficult, and this is the application security. Securing your software, the applications and the programs that your hardware uses. And here you're going to defend through the protection of your applications. You can protect, remember, this is not in isolation, they work together. So you're going to be able to protect your hardware by protecting your software. You may periodically, actually it's why I switched. I don't work for Apple, by the way, but it's why I shifted to Apple. Because if you've been a user of Samsung and the Android systems, the operating systems, you know that the checks and balances in terms of malicious applications is much less than they are in the App Store. And so it's been, over the years, you see that a lot of malicious applications have been developed and they're able to really undermine your systems. And so application security is a very important aspect of cyber as well. And then the third is your information security. And this is about your data privacy. And it's not only the data privacy that you have in terms of the actual maintenance of either your devices or within your network, but it's also about what's in storage. So now I think it's very, very popular. Most people use some kind of information clouds to store your information. Other people have it in hard drives. The point is that just because you've stored it away into somehow a secure place doesn't mean that it's necessarily secure. You need to develop a strategy that whether the data is in storage or whether it's in transit, that data needs to be protected. Now, why do we need such a robust security platform? Well, because there's a terrible amounts of cybersecurity challenges that are happening to us, both on an individual level, but also on a state level. And you see that, and even beyond the states. I mean, you have two main blocks of threats that we can call them two main blocks of threats, but they affect everybody from the individual user straight up to, you know, large corporations, companies, and even states and supranational organizations, be it the United Nations, European Union, GCC, or any number of organizations out there. So the first, and I'm putting these not in like a specific priority list, but just because of my own particular areas of interest. The first is cyber terrorism. So the first block of challenges come out of this cyber terrorism. Cyber terrorism is not only the process of recruiting terrorists, using cyberspace or disseminating propaganda and disinformation. And I also have to say it's not only about terrorist groups, it's also about states that behave in terroristic manners. And here you can get things like digital espionage, trying to take over. These are also state-sponsored terrorist organizations that try to take over systems or spread disinformation to create at home, or sorry, internationally, to create the seeds of discord, to create distrust. For example, I mean, sometimes people bounce around terms like fake news or disinformation, but you have to again ask yourself, what's the reason for it? Why does somebody put out fake news? It's another means of creating disinformation, and disinformation is used to undermine a state. So, just to put it into an example, when Iran is sending forward a disinformation campaign against Saudi Arabia, it's not just to make Saudi Arabia look bad. It's to try to create tension within the country that they can later exploit. So it has an end user result, and the end user, the person, is going to feel, after they've been bombarded by this disinformation for so long, they're going to feel a disconnect from their state, from their community, from their country. And this is when, you know, you go to the next level and you try to exploit that for other goals. So I use the term cyber terrorism not only to focus on terror groups, but to those countries even that use these kind of techniques, this distrust technique, in this kind of terrorist manner, to affect the politics of a particular country or a particular group. I should point out, by the way, for those who are aware and follow cybersecurity news in global affairs, this past week is the first time that NATO recognized Iran as a cyber threat. Because of those activities, their attempts to sow discord even within Europe, but also to try to take over certain systems within a European context. So cyber terrorism is something that we definitely have to protect ourselves from. The other is, of course, cyber crime. So terrorism and crime are this double-edged sword. Cyber crime can be, you know, individuals, opportunistic individuals. They're trying to gain not for political ends, but they're trying to gain for financial ends. I think that everybody here has been exposed to, you know, a Nigerian prince who's trying to, you know, who has 25, million USD in a bank account and wants your information so that he can send you that money. There is no Nigerian prince who actually has 25 million. This is, these phishing techniques trying to get your data information. They're trying to undermine either your systems or your network. So they're trying to access your hardware by leading you down these kind of paths, one step along the way. And of course, at the beginning when these were in vogue, of course, people fell for them quite a lot, not necessarily the Nigerian prince, but other related scams because, we trusted our systems very much and we didn't know to what level they were open to vulnerability, they were open and vulnerable. So these two, I think, pillars are very important to note as we walk more into the realm of cybersecurity, because we also need to see how to change things and what's missing. Because you know, if you think about what is missing from the above, and maybe to move on a little bit to the next section, is that there seems to be a detachment. Of course, we know that there is cyber terrorism, but when you hear cyber terrorism instead of terrorism, if you just said, you know, God forbid, but if I said I was a victim of a terrorist act, people would be like, oh my goodness, what happened to you? Because if you just have the word terrorism, it has a kinetic implication. If you say cyber terrorism, it doesn't have the same acute punchline, because there is a devoid between you as the end user, or the results does not feel as pertinent. If you say that country A was the victim of a cyber attack, that's very different than if you say you're the victim of an attack. This language gap has to close, because a cyber attack is still an attack. A cyber terrorist attack is still an attack. And it can have the same, sometimes even more of an implication. If you think about our water systems now, I know in Bahrain, Bahrain is one of the world leaders in water recycling. It has to be. There's very few resources, freshwater resources. But in water recycling plants, it's almost entirely it's a cyber system that governs the water recycling and the chemical balances. Imagine, and I hope this never happens, but imagine a situation where a cyber terrorist was able to access that kind of vital infrastructure. The devastation can be tremendous. And so it's very important that we no longer separate in the language the idea that a cyber attack or a cyber threat is something less and less pertinent to deal with than a cyber, than a kinetic attack or a kinetic threat. And so this here is an important bridge to make between the kinetic and the cyber world. So what do we need, I think, to redefine cyber is to stop, first and foremost, this artificial separation between the two. I think that issues, and here COVID really comes in and helps us, because now I think COVID, of course, we shouldn't say it helps. We would have rather not had to deal with COVID. But since we have had to deal with COVID, there are some important lessons that we're learning as a result of it. The first one is in relation to the lines of communication. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few moments when I talk specifically about Bahrain. But when it comes to the lines of communication, cyber is going to play a much more important role for broadcasting vital messages directly from governments and other authorities to individuals. Nobody I know does not have a mobile phone any longer. We don't speak about things in those terms. There's not a gap any longer within our societies. And if your great-grandmother, hopefully is still around, and your great-grandmother doesn't have a mobile phone, you could be sure that her caregiver, the direct caregiver, does. And so all of a sudden, we have to see that developing a new kind of communication service in which direct information goes from an authority to an individual person will become very important for dealing with future challenges. So we're utilizing live feed and live information, but we have to secure those lines of communication. We noticed, if you notice those people who have used Zoom throughout the beginning until today of the crisis, you've seen that Zoom itself has been prone to manipulation and digital espionage. They've had to refine their own security apparatuses because almost everything is taken, migrated from the personal into the cyber. And so all of a sudden Zoom has to double its security and explore with much more severity what kind of challenges it's going to face because of the vital flow of communication. So the platforms that we use for the broadcasting of our lines of communication need to be reinforced. And we have to have the end user in mind. The second thing that we need to, I think, remember again as we talk about humans and about people is about the protection from augmented realities and deep fakes. Because now that everybody is online, we are more exposed to deep fake technologies. Just now in this one conversation, because I use a similar background here, and very often wear a similar shirt and tie. People who are, for example, malicious people will be able to take me, change my mouth, and basically get me to say anything that they want me to say. We need to really double down on our ability of interdicting deepfake, fake news, and stopping the deepfakes from being taken as, you know, real-time, real information. And the third thing I think that really needs to be explored is the early warning systems. The early warning systems that are in place. I've seen there's been some very important cases now of information being able to be, let's say, broadcast again through our lines of communication in relation to the warnings that are being issued. In relation, and this is something I'll talk a little bit more about directly with Bahrain, when it came to the recommendations of the World Health Organization, that we were able to see an increase in the speed, but also the dissemination of the information in a timely manner right into our devices as soon as we knew that this was, you know, the kind of crisis that could be world encompassing. So you did speed up the process, but I think again, our early warning systems, we should go back in time a little bit and see what we did wrong globally and see how to make it better and include it into our cyber optic. That's because, I mean, now we're talking about COVID-19, and COVID-19 is certainly an important test. And I also have to say it's an easy test. This, I know that, and I say this with a heavy heart, a lot of people have died, and we should never forget their death. We should learn from their deaths. And we should also know that this is an easy test because our reactions to it have been fairly rapid. Of course, there are things that could have been done differently, but this was not the same, for example, as a biological weapon or, you know, a conflict situation. But it's testing the same systems. It's testing our rapid reaction. It's testing our resilience. It's testing our, you know, our awareness, our ability of communicating. But imagine, heaven forbid, but imagine this was a chemical attack. How quickly, when you had to deal with a massive amount of death in a small amount of time, how quick are our services going to be able to provide information and turn that information into something that is actionable? Getting people to stay at home, getting people to self-isolate, ensuring that the lines of communication, both between individuals, but also between the state and individuals, healthcare officials and individuals, healthcare officials and the states, that relationship can carry on no matter what the circumstances are. And it's here where the case of Bahrain becomes very important, because I not only am I very interested in what happens in Bahrain individually, but also it's really become, I think, for those people who honestly look at a comparative analysis of how different countries have reacted to COVID-19 and the outbreak of COVID-19, you really get to see how quickly Bahrain reacted to the crisis and what policies were implemented, because I think there is an important learning curve that others can learn from Bahrain, just as Bahrain can learn from others as well. It's a two-way street. And so just to be clear, when I was last in Bahrain in January, very few people had learned or heard of COVID. It was somehow in the back of our mind's eye, but I remember very clearly getting off the airplane, flying through Dubai. Dubai had already set up early temperature warnings so that they would identify people that had temperatures. Of course, Dubai is a global hub. And then I remember traveling and arriving in Bahrain, no mask, but seeing that all the security personnel and the border patrol already had their masks on. They were already in anticipation. Now, that is not just an individual security border controls decision. That decision has to come from on top of the pyramid. So it means already in January, there was not only an assessment, but a decision that had been taken that this is a virus that is going to spread quickly, that we don't have a command as to where it's coming from and what its impact is going to be, but it's better to take a precaution. And so the idea of the information flow coming from the World Health Organization and other allies, in this case of Bahrain, and being able to rapidly, very quickly, because I have to say in Sweden and in the Czech Republic and in Italy, of course, these measures came much later. They came more than a month and a half later, in fact. And so you see that there was an uninterrupted information flow. And here is where you can see where cyber works, because there you can get the flow of information uninterrupted, and it will have a real-time impact, so that the security guards at the border, as you get off the aircraft, are already prepared. They already have this in mind, that this could be something bigger. And so from there, also in Bahrain, you had the Be Aware, the hashtag Be Aware campaign. You had the hashtag the Team Bahrain, which were basically two re-emphasizing one another. They were providing information that was very important and broadcasting that information. For me, the most interesting aspects of these campaigns were the hotlines that were established in multi-languages, from Arabic and English, and I know that Hindi was also used, and I think 7, I'm not entirely sure, but I think 7 languages. You had
French,
a hotline.
Urdu.
French, Urdu, it's amazing. Multiple languages, you can call, you can find out what symptoms you have. If there's a severity within the symptoms, they will send you to the right facility. The field hospitals were built immediately. And so I think that this idea of being able to put together an action plan where there's information flows from the WHO, from the national health authorities, and that they can reach every single resident in the country in rapid speed, is going to help slow down contagion. And especially when you put together with having doctors which are online. And again, this shows you that bridge between the kinetic and the cyber. Because here you don't need, in proximity, you don't need to go to the doctor's office. In past times, you need to go to the doctor's office. 1, 2 coughs, next thing you know, the doctor is sick, and the doctor will spread that disease further. Here you stop that problem. You interrupt it, because now you can go and have an online conversation with a medical expert to find out what your symptoms are and to make a rough calculation. Of course, it's not going to be the same 100%, but it's going to put a rough calculation as to what to do next. In Bahrain also, I know that you've mentioned the tracing apps. These tracing applications are only now being utilized with their trials in Europe. This had something to do with the laws of data protection. But what you see is that these tracing apps, once you get through the data protection, i.e. once again, your cybersecurity, protecting your data both in storage and in transit, once you get through that, these apps are amazing. Because first, in a rapid way, think about it. In 3 months, teams of researchers in Bahrain have been able to put together tracing applications to see how people have contacted and how the mapping of the diseases worked in terms of its contagion. And this helps not only the scientific community, because it's able to see how the trend is, but it's also helping to restrict by information, to restrict contagion. Because if you've been exposed, then you can go back into your quarantine, because you know that you don't want anybody else to be infected because potentially you've been infected. And so it will help with the quarantine process, and through that quarantine, you'll be able to slow down, if not totally eradicate it.
Dr. Michel, since you mentioned the tracing apps, let me ask you one question about them.
Sure.
If people installed a dedicated COVID-19 contact tracing application on their phones, their movements could be tracked via GPS, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth proximity sensing. A group of experts and academics works in cybersecurity, privacy, and law say that the contact tracing apps could open the door to privacy violation, and they must not be rolled out without strict safeguards. What can you say about this?
Yeah,
and even people confused about these apps. Some of people see that they are against their freedom and privacy, but other people see them as they are a very useful tool to save lives and lower risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a debate that many people will have, and they'll basically have forever. But from my point of view, first and foremost, there has to be a degree of trust. You have to trust that your health authorities actually have your health as the most important aspect of why they're doing this and developing these apps. When the pandemic is over, you delete the app. The app is then gone. You turn off your location services on your phone and it's over. But until that happens, and we should also be reminded that most of our social media also requires location services. If you don't have a problem with allowing Facebook to use your your location services for when you post a selfie somewhere, which is a very individualistic type of thing, you also shouldn't be that concerned when it comes to a public health issue. Of course, there are places where I wouldn't want to do that. If I won't be there, but if I ever was in North Korea, I would not want, for example, because there's a huge gap between your individual trust to your state. But in other places, in places where you do trust your state, because you know that your state does, and your health authorities do have your interests in mind, for the duration of the pandemic, I have no problem with those applications. I think that they're important for interdicting this disease, for stopping it. If you don't have this kind of real-time information, contagion can become, well, contagious. And in a very small state like Bahrain, that could be very devastating because it's a very small population in one of the most dense places on earth. I think the seventh most dense country on earth, with a big concentration of population in a very small place. So in order to prevent rapid and wild contagion, you really need to have the use of these technologies, but they do need to be safeguarded. You would hate to have an external actor hacking into those databases. So I think finding out where people live and how people move, and that is a real concern, which is why those apps need to have a real cybersecurity protocol put in place as well to protect that data and that information. So, but I know that in the case of Bahrain, and I also know in the case where these are being trialed in Europe, that those two positions are going hand in hand. How to protect data while also utilizing the information that's there to make to resist and to stop this contagion. To be honest with you, I can really wrap up on this point because I think your question is very valid, and it opens up our discussion about the lessons not only learned from Bahrain, but the lessons that we're all experiencing in COVID as it relates to cyber. It's become a very important tool for us. We see it and understand it much more now than perhaps we did before, and in that way, I could probably end my parts here by myself and start with our question and answer. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Michel, for this insightful speech. Let me ask you one question. Bahrain and other GCC states have made some progress in stimulating its overall cyber readiness during the past decade. In light of the pandemic impact on digital transformation and cybersecurity, how important is developing a strong national cybersecurity strategy in the GCC countries?
Yeah, it's vitally important. The more I think about it, the more I think that there should be something like a cyber command on the GCC level, or at least a kind of information system in which the national cyber commands are able to meet and share and process data information. Like I said before, this is a relatively easy crisis to deal with. Everybody's experiencing it at the same time, more or less, with a little bit of lag. It's a a kind of crisis that entails individual behavior, but individual behavior is basically staying at home and keeping social distance and being aware, rather than being, engaged and providing information through the authorities so that they can make informed decisions. It's a much easier kind of crisis. But given the other kinds of challenges that could be on the horizon that will relate to cyber, like I said before, massive cyber attacks, or I'll put it into a real-time perspective. Last September, Saudi Arabia's Aramco was hit by a kinetic attack by Iran at the same time as cyber attacks. They've been trying to penetrate into Aramco for some time. That was a real-timed attack that entailed real-time information and intelligence. And I think that the kind of information that could have prevented that attack would have only been available in the sense that you had a combined command and communication structure at the GCC level that was also paying attention to what was happening in Iran in terms of their planning strategies. So I think what COVID is teaching us is that we do need to have a kind of cyber commands on the national levels that share information on the supranational level within the GCC structures. Very, very important.
Mm-hmm. And what about the role of the private sector? Can the companies, what companies need to do to contribute to the national cybersecurity strategy?
I'm a very firm believer in PPP, in public-private, in private partner, I'm tongue-tied, in private-public partnerships. I'm a very big supporter of that when it comes to cyber, because of the innovation. Some states are very good at innovation themselves. They have very important bodies that invest very heavily in research and development. Other states are weaker in that and allow their private sector to develop. In the case of Bahrain, I know you have a wonderful PPP in relation to financial technologies, fintech. By the way, am I still online?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry, I froze for a minute. I know that in Bahrain, the fintech has been a very big winner in all this because people have migrated their banking online in the last months. It's the biggest fintech company, I think, is called BenefitPay in Bahrain.
It's a national digital wallet.
Yeah, it's incredible. I saw the statistics now. There's been a 1,000% increase, and now something like 30% of the entire Bahrain population, that's something like 400,000 people now use the application. So, I mean, it's really an incredible development. But again, because of the technologies, sometimes you need to have private sector, sometimes you need public sector, but in the end, there should be some kind of mechanism to put together, the two sides. I think that you need to have innovation and research and development, but you also need to have a purpose, which is not only about profit making. I think that states and the companies that operate within those states need to work together to developing a kind of public interest. Otherwise, a lot of money goes into a lot of pockets, but it doesn't necessarily help the public. So I think around the world, we need to see more relationships in this PPP frameworks, especially when it comes to startups and trying to engage new types of innovation. The applications that we've seen in this COVID period have been incredible. Even the tracing app, think about how important that kind of app is when it comes to, combating a public health challenge. It's been incredible. So it's very, very vital that we again re-emphasize PPP.
Mm-hmm. Okay, during the pandemic, many Gulf states utilized their years of investment in digital transformation, and it finally paid off in Bahrain, UAE, and Saudi Arabia with a swift shift to remote working to limit the outbreak. And globally, millions of people have been forced to work remotely, but experts say the practice won't necessarily stick. So, what do you think will happen? Could COVID-19 usher a new era of working from home and create new job opportunities?
Definitely. I think we're never going to return to exactly how things were. Also because we've learned that you don't necessarily need to have the huge audiences for events, or you don't need to travel to share your experience. You can also do it, you know, from your offices, from your spaces, but have a much wider global impact. And so I think that whether it's companies or think tanks or researchers or universities, that people are sitting and thinking, it's not necessarily about working from home, but it's about redefining your global presence so that you can actually share your information with your expert communities without having to, you know, host these mega events or travel tens of thousands of kilometers there and back in order to, you know, present your findings. You can actually do it in a different manner. Of course, there is nothing like the human touch, and we should. I'm also a strong advocate of that human touch. We should not just, you know, disregard that, but maybe not all kinds of travel is necessary. I know here in Italy, there are now law firms, for example, that have, for example, if a law firm was paying 1 million euros a month in rent for 3 floors of office space in the center of Rome, now they can have 2 floors of office space, get rid of one, save 250,000 euros a month by getting the same lawyers to work from home. And then what they did is they did a one-time payment to each of the lawyers to build something into their house as like a home office. And then they can go to the board meetings in the office once a week or twice a week. And so this is redeveloping, you know, kind of business models. So the effects will be long lasting. I think that we'll see definite changes in terms of our approach to public spaces and healthcare within those public spaces being, you know, more hygienic in closed spaces. I know that online platforms for commerce have also become, I mean, you know, it's a shame that not all of us invested in Amazon long before this crisis, but e-commerce is definitely going to get a boom after this. Why go shop when you can order online? It's going to be a lot easier. So our societies will, I think, definitely change in the long term. And as a result, like I said at the beginning, our cybersecurity needs to adjust ourselves so that we no longer look at it as a different realm, but a realm in which we are, you know, very actively engaged.
Mhm. Okay, there is a wide range of digital technologies that can be used to enhance the public health strategies, like artificial intelligence, blockchain, Internet of Things, and data analysis. In your opinion, what challenges or factors that might be more important to be considered by the health authorities when adopting these technologies in the future?
Again, I mean, to be honest with you, I think that these are, it's the same set of questions in relation to that nice balance between regulation and kind of legal regulation and healthcare interests. I think healthcare authorities have to use all means at their disposal when you have a health pandemic. This is no longer, you know, a question of do we now start to, for example, to I don't know, to trace, let's just stick with the tracing for now, but do we now ask ourselves fundamental questions about what that means legally, or do we answer the question of how to preserve life as best we can? I think in these kind of crisis situations, you just use all means at your disposal to preserve human life. Afterwards, you can start asking questions. Once the crisis is no longer an acute crisis, Once it's no longer a pandemic, then you can ask, what do we do in terms of regulation of this? But until then, we have to put as the prime results is the preservation of human life. And so all these techniques should be utilized, I think.
Well, it's a very great answer. 4 minutes left. I have to end this session. Sorry. I don't know. So we are coming to the end of this webinar. Thank you so much, Dr. Michelle, for sharing your thoughts and experience with us. I really enjoyed it. Also, I would like to extend my thanks to all the participants for attending this webinar. I really appreciate that you take the time to listen to it. Goodbye, and stay tuned for our upcoming webinars.
Thank you very much for having me as well. I know we didn't get through all the questions, but for those people who have questions, please send them all along by email, and I'll be happy to answer them as quickly as possible. But thank you so much, Doctora, for your moderation, and thank you so much, Derasat, for hosting. Shukran jazilan.
Have fun. See you. Thank you. Bye.